Beneath a sky that never brightened, amid endless blizzards without end, were born the ones we now call cave people. They walked barefoot over frozen earth, inhaled icy air, and from their first breath, fought not for life, but for the right to die later. The air temperature dropped so low that a person without shelter could die within hours. This wasn't just a cold era. It was a global survival regime that allowed no mistakes. Cave people had no clothing as we understand it. Their garments consisted of raw, often poorly dried hides that barely retained heat. Soaked through, froze, and clung to the skin. Flesh cracked open, feet became ulcerated, especially when forced to move barefoot through the snow. In Italy, footprints of Neanderthals were found preserved in solidified volcanic ash, proving that they traveled part of the way barefoot in brutal conditions. Their anatomy became a weapon. Massive brow ridges, wide nasal passages to warm the air upon inhalation, and jaws capable of crushing bone. Their brains were smaller, but their muscle mass greater, functioning like a biological furnace. Broad chests, shorter limbs, all evolved to minimize heat loss. Dozens of skeletal remains confirm this. But even with these physical advantages, their existence was a constant balancing act on the edge of death. Human remains have been found with clear signs of frostbite, amputations, and deformation. Some skulls show healed wounds, trauma after which they continue to survive. In France and Spain, archaeologists discovered skeletons with healed fractures in arms and legs, clear evidence that these people were not abandoned. In tribes without doctors or knowledge, amputation could be the only way to save a life, done with stone tools. Food was a constant problem. Hunts could last for days, but acquiring meat never guaranteed safety. Every campsite became a scent beacon for predators. In many locations, including modern-day Czechia and Ukraine, archaeologists have found settlements where animal remains lay beside human bones marked with identical cut marks. This may indicate the consumption of the dead, sometimes from starvation, sometimes perhaps as part of a farewell ritual, or an attempt to absorb strength. Children were born into the cold with no knowledge of hygiene, surrounded by hides, blood, and carcasses. There were no conditions for infant survival. It's estimated that child mortality could have reached 50%, and that's only among those who lived for a few weeks. Tiny skulls have been found with signs of deformation or fractures, most often cranial trauma. Was it accident, the brutal nature of birth, or something darker, the deliberate ending of lives to preserve resources? We still don't know. Caves were not cozy refuges. Often, they were narrow crevices in rock. No fire, constant dampness, and drafts. People did what they could, digging pits, covering them with mammoth hides, reinforcing the sides with bones. In some areas, archaeologists found remains of bone structures, hand-assembled barricades made from animal fragments, serving as shields against wind and wild beasts. Sometimes, they slept inside the carcass of a mammoth, using the warmth of the body. Paleontological reports from Siberia confirm such findings. Their nights were short and anxious. Fire was a rare and precious resource. Ash deposits found in caves are scattered and inconsistent. Many groups were nomadic, never settling. In some places, large quantities of charcoal were discovered beside corpses, possibly used to warm the body. But often, it was too late. Death was a routine part of life. It came silently, suddenly, or violently. In many cases, skeletons show no signs of trauma. No fractures, no blows. Just a body frozen in a seated or lying position. Sometimes in an embrace. This tells us they froze unexpectedly, exhausted, starved, resigned. Sometimes together. Their entire lives were a battle against climate, hunger, pain, and fear. The traces they left in the earth are not a romantic tale of survival, but proof of how brutally difficult life truly was during what we now casually call the Ice Age. And every bone we uncover isn't just evidence. It's a scream from the past, echoing through the centuries, from a world where weakness meant death. Survival during the Ice Age wasn't a heroic hunt, as often shown in movies. It was blood, fear, and cunning. Hunting wasn't just a way to get food. It was a ritual of endurance that required not just strength, but cruelty. The prehistoric human was forced to become a ruthless predator because everything around them either ran away or killed. Hunting mammoths was one of the most infamous and brutal methods of obtaining meat. In regions like Siberia and Central Europe, archaeologists have found deep pits lined with sharpened stakes where mammoths were trapped. Their legs would break and they wouldn't die immediately. In one such trap in Czechia, remains of 5 mammoths were found, with broken limbs and dozens of puncture wounds in their bones. This tells us only one thing: they were finished off slowly and painfully. Their backs, skulls, even ribs, all pierced with spears. It wasn't a hunt, it was a prolonged execution, carried out with a single goal: to eat and to survive. Huge stone hammers weighing over 20 kilograms were used to strike the animal's head. In France, a mammoth was found with a crushed skull, direct evidence that it had been beaten to death manually. Sometimes, the animal's insides were cut open before it was even fully dead, not out of cruelty, but hunger, urgency, and fear that the meat would be lost. These weren't scenes of triumph. They were struggles for calories, where pity had no place. These hunts could last hours, even days. People would wear down the beast, chasing it into swamps or beneath thin ice. Sometimes, they used fire, creating smoke corridors to disorient the animal. In some caves, paintings depict animals surrounded by fire, or people falling beneath mammoth feet. These weren't just tactics, they were risks. People died in these hunts regularly, and every animal killed could cost multiple lives. After the kill, the carcass was dismembered on site. Archaeological sites have revealed hundreds of tools: knives, scrapers, stone blades. At one camp in Germany, over 3,000 tool fragments were found around a single carcass. Bones were used to make spear throwers, tendons became cords and bowstrings, hides became shelter. The internal organs were eaten first. They had the most calories and spoiled the fastest. Liver, kidneys, heart. Nothing was wasted. Then comes the subject of cannibalism. The evidence for it during the Ice Age is real. The most well-known example is El Sidrón Cave in Spain, where human bones were found with characteristic cut marks, showing that flesh had been removed. Even more, the bones had human bite marks. This isn't speculation. These are documented facts, proving that cave people, trapped or isolated, consumed their dead. Maybe only after death, maybe as ritual, or maybe under the weight of starvation, when there simply was no choice. Some signs suggest that the dead were not only a source of meat, but of raw materials. Human bones were turned into needles, awls, and blades. In France, fragments of human skulls were discovered, shaped into bowls. This may have been ritual or pure necessity. In caves where such artifacts were found, mass burials were also uncovered, suggesting food shortages during long entrapments. Winters were long, and when a person is left with cold, hunger, and a corpse beside them, the choice is made not by logic, but by instinct. Sometimes these hunting scenes were drawn on cave walls, with blood, ochre, and animal fat, not as heroism, but as instruction or warning. Some caves show incomplete images: the animal in the center, people around it, one line face down. No sign of victory, just death, sweat, and loss. In some places, archaeologists found traces of large concentrations of urine and feces in a single spot, possibly locations of mass animal driving. The stench, the fear, the screams, the cracking bones. all part of a scene impossible to imagine without horror. This wasn't the life of a noble hunter, but of someone who threw themselves to the edge of survival, not knowing if they would return with meat or become part of the next campsite. Hunting wasn't always a choice. Sometimes humans were the prey. Cave people didn't sit atop the food chain. They clung to its edge, constantly at risk of being devoured. Every day wasn't just a fight for food. It was a desperate attempt not to become someone else's meal. And the bones left behind from that era still tell us humans didn't always win. Many human remains discovered by archaeologists show bite marks from predators. In Spain, France, the Balkans, even Siberia, bones have been found with clear signs of tearing, puncturing, and missing body parts. Saber-toothed cats, creatures weighing up to 300 kilograms with fangs nearly 20 centimeters long, didn't shy away from human flesh. Some bones display cuts and gashes consistent with such teeth. But even more terrifying were cave lions, larger than today's African lions. And unlike them, they hunted in groups. Evidence of this includes multiple predator tracks around destroyed settlements, where nothing remained but scattered bones. These bones show human rib cages torn open from the inside, as if a predator dug straight into the heart. Skulls were often shattered or missing, possibly from paw strikes or decapitation. In other cases, the lower body was completely gone, matching the feeding behavior of large felines. These are not just deaths, they are scenes of blood and panic. People weren't hunters in these moments, they were meat. Another forgotten monster of the Ice Age was the short-faced bear. Weighing up to a ton and standing over 3.5 meters tall, this predator was more carnivorous than its brown bear cousins. Its jaws, according to biomechanical studies, could crush a human pelvis with a single bite. In caves believed to be its dens, human remains have been found, sometimes with pierced skulls, sometimes with torn limbs. In parts of Canada and Alaska, archaeological sites show signs of sudden abandonment. No belongings, no tools, only shredded bones. These bears were known to enter human camps, especially during winter, when people hid in the same caves the predators called home. Humans tried to protect themselves. In some settlements, large mammoth bones were arranged around the perimeter, not for storage, but as deterrents. Skulls faced outward, perhaps meant to intimidate. In some areas, bones were even buried vertically into the ground, forming a kind of bone palisade. In Central Europe, sites have been found with stakes in rows, topped with human bones. Was this ritual or a message? We don't know, but the fear behind it is undeniable. Sometimes fire was their only defense, but keeping it lit on windy nights was difficult. Archaeologists have found remnants of burned-out fires, and nearby, signs of hasty escape. In caves in France and Austria, entrances were blocked with stones from the inside. This means people tried to barricade themselves. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. In several of these caves, bodies have been found deep inside, scattered, torn apart, suggesting a predator broke through. Encounters with predators were often sudden, but the fear of being hunted was constant. In cave art, we see not only humans hunting animals, but animals chasing humans. One of the most famous examples comes from La Madeleine Cave in France, where a figure lies next to a looming beast. It isn't a story of triumph. It's a confession of helplessness. Even after the predators were gone, their impact remained. Some human skulls show strange deformities, possibly the result of trauma during attacks, or, as anthropologists suggest, signs of prolonged psychological stress. Living in a world where every sound might signal death wasn't just hard. It was mental torture, stretching over years. Cave people weren't masters of their world. They were guests, and all too often, guests the world tried to consume. Caves were never homes in the way we understand them. They didn't protect, they didn't warm. They were dark, damp, foul-smelling and filled with unease. These were depths where voices echoed and fear seeped into the skin. But it was here that people tried to hide, and it was here they left behind some of the most haunting evidence. Hundreds of images have been found on cave walls, depictions not of triumph, but of agony. People kneeling before animals, figures pierced through the chest, chaotic scenes where not only humans are hunting. In some drawings, large creatures appear to stalk humans or stand over them. In several caves, the images are cut off mid-line, as if the artist didn't have time to finish. These aren't rituals. They're attempts to convey terror. Some drawings weren't made with paint, but with blood. In the Chauvet cave in France, samples of ochre mixed with animal blood and fat were discovered. Dried smears confirmed in laboratory tests. People painted with whatever was at hand, and often that meant death. Some of these images are located so deep within the caves that reaching them today requires hours of descent through absolute darkness. In Niau Cave in Spain, the gallery containing paintings lies over 500 meters inside. No natural light. Narrow tunnels. One has to crawl. This raises a simple question. Why? Why paint so far in? Perhaps to hide? Or perhaps these were final messages from people who knew they would never return. In certain caves, bones have been found arranged strangely. Human remains mixed with animal ones. In Gunnersdorf Cave, archaeologists discovered fragmented bodies not buried, but scattered, with cut marks, fractures, and often signs of burning. Maybe they were ritually cremated. Maybe there was an attempt to destroy the dead who had become dangerous. But some of the bodies appeared to be sealed, embedded in the ground, wedged between stones as if forcibly locked away forever. Entrances to several caves were found deliberately blocked from the inside. These weren't natural rockfalls. They were intentional, systematic actions. People were sealing themselves in. In one such cave, Bramble, the remains of several adults and a child were discovered deep inside. All of them close together. No fire, no food. Perhaps they were hiding. Perhaps they were waiting. Perhaps they starved to death without ever reopening the way out. Many caves show signs of fire, but not hearths, torches. Soot marks stretch along the ceilings for dozens of meters. They show that people moved deep into the darkness and left behind their trace. But some never returned. Archaeologists have found abandoned items in dead-end chambers, dropped stones, spear fragments, shattered skulls, as if someone had fled or wandered in the dark and never found the exit. All of this paints the image not of shelter, but of dread. Caves were like traps. They held warmth, but also darkness. Inside, you could never be sure you were alone. Echoes answered with multiple voices. Water dripped so slowly, it could drive a person mad. And in those conditions, humans left behind the most powerful evidence of their anxiety. These walls were not art. They were spells, warnings, testimonies, and very often, the final words of those who never saw daylight again. Some of them never left the caves again, not because they died, but because they chose to stay, and perhaps not alone. Across Europe, Siberia, and parts of Asia, dozens of tunnel systems have been discovered that serve no obvious purpose. They don't lead to shelters, they don't end in camps, and they show no signs of daily life. These are narrow, long, almost geometrically precise corridors dug into the earth or carved into rock. In some cases, they stretch hundreds of meters, but there is no light, no evidence of use, no explanation. Who built these passages and why remains a mystery. One theory suggests these were transit routes for tribes that had isolated themselves from the surface world. But what happened to them? There are anthropological records of skulls that don't fully match either Cro-Magnon or Neanderthal types. Smaller cranial cavities, elongated faces, deep and widened eye sockets, as if adapted to life in the dark. Such remains have been found in various regions, including the Caucasus and the mountains of northern Italy. These are not mutants, and officially not another species, but they may be the descendants of those who went underground and never came back. And who adapted, slowly, over generations. On the walls of some caves are handprints, made with ochre pressed against stone, but some are unusual. The finger proportions are unnatural. The pinky is longer than the index. The palm widens in the center and narrows at the edges. And most strikingly, some are located over 3 meters above ground, in places where an ordinary human couldn't reach without scaffolding. No steps, no tool marks, just darkness and those hands, watching from above. In the folklore of many northern peoples, there are tales of beings who live beneath the earth, pale as bone, fear the light, and take children. These are not just stories. Similar descriptions appear in songs, carvings, and legends. In some regions of Siberia, there were taboos against entering certain caves because they breathe. What exactly that meant is hard to say, but the fear ran deep enough that for generations, locals avoided those places altogether. Some caves contain evidence of microbial life, fungi and bacteria that only thrive with consistent organic presence. This suggests that the humidity, temperature, and conditions in those tunnels remain stable for long periods. It was warm. It was survivable. But whether there was light, no one knows. In several of these caves, strange acoustic anomalies are still reported, echoes that don't match the sounds made, or noises that arise in total silence. Official science blames it on cave acoustics. Locals believe otherwise. Could it be that some didn't go extinct, but went into hiding? That by choosing darkness, they lost what was human, but kept what was necessary to survive? And is it true that in certain places, people still hear breathing from deep below? Not wind, not earth, but something else? There are things that vanished from history, not because they never existed, but because they remained beneath it. In the depths, where human light no longer reaches. In the deepest caves, on walls covered in mold and centuries of dust, there appear creatures that resemble neither bears nor lions. Elongated bodies, long tails, necks covered in scales. In some scenes, they chase humans. In others, they lie dead with torn bellies. In a few, they stare directly at the viewer. These depictions don't match any known Ice Age fauna. Researchers still argue whether they are imagination or a reflection of real encounters. In South America, engraved stones have been found showing humans interacting with dinosaur-like creatures. Some of these were documented before the wave of forgeries began. The scenes depict hunting, fighting, egg theft. Some late Paleolithic sites contain bone fragments that match no known species. Many remain officially unclassified. There are places where large egg-shaped structures were found, labeled as geological anomalies despite their symmetry. In the folklore of tribes from the Amazon, Asia, and the North, there are stories of beings emerging from caves, rivers, cracks in the earth. They breathed cold air, took livestock, showed no fear of fire. Many cultures from the Chinese to the Celts had legends of giant reptiles living underground or hunting in the night. The images, stories, and descriptions align, even among civilizations that never met. This isn't proof, but it isn't coincidence either. In nature, identical inventions don't arise across dozens of disconnected cultures. Some reptiles may have survived in warm, isolated regions, places where the temperature never dropped below freezing. Deep fissures, thermal caves, volcanic systems. Most of these areas remain unexplored. History has examples of extinct species reappearing, not because they returned, but because they never left. The question isn't whether dinosaurs survived a cataclysm. The question is whether humanity truly knows what it survived. Everything we see in archaeology is fragments, remains of bodies, walls, bones, tools. But between them, gaps. Gaps filled not by fantasy, but silence. The silence in which those people lived. People who left no written words, but left behind fear. People who stepped into darkness not knowing what waited. They feared more than predators, more than hunger. They feared the land itself, breathing, and the dark that wasn't empty. We don't know what they encountered, but we know something was stronger than them. The only ones who survived were those who could hide, kill, and stay silent. Everything else remains beneath the stone and waits.